Chapter 18. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, the transition to imperialism pre-monopoly capitalism, with free competition predominating, attained the apex of its development in the 1860s and 1870s. During the last third of the 19th century there took place the transition from pre-monopoly to monopoly capitalism. Monopoly capitalism finally took shape towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Monopoly capitalism, or imperialism, is the highest and last stage of capitalism, with the replacement of free competition by the dominance of monopolies as its fundamental distinguishing feature. The transition from pre-monopoly capitalism to monopoly capitalism, imperialism, was prepared by the entire process of development of the productive forces and relations of production in bourgeois society. The last third of the 19th century was marked by large-scale technical advances and by the growth and concentration of industry. In metallurgy, new methods of smelting steel were introduced widely. Bessemer, Thomas Martin. A rapid spread of new types of prime mover, the dynamo, the internal combustion engine, the steam turbine, the electric motor, accelerated the development of industry and transport. The progress made in science and technique made possible the production of electric power on a mass scale in fuel-burning power stations and later in large hydroelectric stations. The use of electric power led to the creation of a number of new branches of the chemical industry and of metallurgy. The use of chemical methods was extended in a number of branches and processes of production. Improvements in the internal combustion engine made possible the appearance and spread of motor transport and later of aviation. In the middle of the 19th century, the predominant place in the industry of the capitalist countries was still occupied by light industry. Numerous enterprises of comparatively small size belonged to individual owners, and the relative importance of joint stock companies was comparatively slight. The economic crisis of 1873 brought about the collapse of many businesses of this kind and gave a strong fillip to the concentration and centralization of capital. The predominant role in the industry of the main capitalist countries now began to be played by heavy industry, above all metallurgy and engineering, and also the mining industry, for the development of which enormous amount of capital were needed. The spread of joint stock companies on a wide scale still further increased the centralization of capital. The volume of world industrial production grew threefold between 1870 and 1900. World smelting of steel grew from 0.5 million tons in 1870 to 28 million tons in 1900, and world smelting of pig iron from 12.2 million tons to 40.7 million. The development of power engineering, metallurgy, and chemistry led to a growth in the world output of coal, from 218 million tons in 1870 to 769 million in 1900, and of petroleum, from 0.8 million tons to 20 million tons. The growth of industrial production was closely connected with the development of railway transport. In 1835, 10 years after the construction of the first railway, there were 1,500 miles of railway track in the world. In 1870 there were over 125,000, and in 1900 500,000. Maritime routes came to be served by large vessels driven by steam-operated machinery and internal combustion engines. During the 19th century, the capitalist mode of production spread rapidly throughout the world. At the beginning of the 1870s, the oldest bourgeois country, Britain, still produced more cloth, smelted more pig iron and mined more coal than the USA, Germany, France, Italy, Russia, and Japan taken together. Britain held the leading place in world industrial production and an undivided monopoly of the world market. Towards the end of the 19th century, the situation underwent a marked change. In the younger capitalist countries, large-scale industries of their own had grown up. Owing to this, Britain lost her industrial leadership and her monopoly position on the world market. In respect of volume of industrial production, the USA took first place in the world, and Germany first place in Europe. Russia was moving rapidly along the path of industrial development, though this was hindered by the numerous survivals of serfdom in the country's economic and social system and by the Tsarist regime, which was rotten through and through. As the transition to imperialism took place, the contradictions between the productive forces and the production relations of capitalism came to assume ever more acute forms. The subjection of production to the capitalist's hunt for the highest possible profit created very many barriers to the development of the productive forces. Economic crises of overproduction began to recur more frequently. Their destructive force increased, and the army of unemployed became more numerous. Alongside the growth of poverty and misery among the working masses of town and country, there took place an unprecedented increase in the wealth concentrated in the hands of a small group of exploiters. The sharpening of the irreconcilable class contradictions between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat led to intensification of the economic and political struggle of the working class. During the period of transition to imperialism, the largest capitalist powers of Europe and America made themselves masters of huge colonial possessions by force and fraud. The ruling circles of the capitalistically developed countries transformed the majority of the inhabitants of the globe into colonial slaves who hated their oppressors and struggled against them. Colonial conquests enormously extended the field for capitalist exploitation. At the same time, the degree of exploitation of the working masses steadily grew. The extreme sharpening of the contradictions of capitalism found expression in devastating imperialist wars, which carried off a host of human lives and destroyed a vast quantity of material wealth. The historical credit for having undertaken a Marxist analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, and at the same time as the eve of the socialist revolution of the proletariat, belongs to V. Lenin. In his classic work Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and in a number of other works, mostly written during the First World War, Lenin summed up the development of world capitalism in the half-century which had elapsed since Marx's Capital appeared. Basing himself on the laws, discovered by Marx and Engels, of the rise, development, and decline of capitalism, Lenin gave an exhaustive scientific analysis of the economic and political essence of imperialism, its laws and its insoluble contradictions. In Lenin's classic definition, the fundamental economic features of imperialism are the following. 1. The concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital, which has become extremely important, as distinguished from the export of commodities. 4. The formation of international capitalist monopolies, which share the world among themselves. And 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers is completed. Lenin. Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol I, Point 2, page 525. Concentration of production and monopolies. Monopolies and competition. Free competition, which prevailed in the pre-monopoly stage of capitalism, brought about a rapid process of concentration of production in ever larger enterprises. The operation of the law of concentration and centralization of capital inevitably led to the victory of large and very large enterprises, as compared with which the small and medium enterprises came to play an ever more subordinate role. In its turn, the concentration of production prepared the transition from the dominance of free competition to that of monopolies, which abolished freedom of competition, and at the same time made the competitive struggle in the capitalist world especially fierce and devastating. In Germany, there were concentrated in enterprises with more than 50 workers each. In 1882, 22% of all manual and clerical workers. In 1895, 30%. In 1907, 37%. In 1925, 47.2%. And in 1939, 49.9%. The share of the largest enterprises, those employing more than 1,000, in the whole of industry grew from 1907 to 1925 as follows. In terms of the numbers employed, from 9.6% to 13.3%, and in horsepower, from 32% to 41%. In 1952, in Western Germany, 84.6% of all workers were concentrated in enterprises with 50 or more workers, and of these, 3,411% were in the largest enterprises, with 1,000 and upwards in employment. In the USA in 1904, the largest enterprises, those with production valued at $1 million or over, made up 0.9% of the total number of enterprises. In these enterprises, 25.6% of the total number of workers were employed, and they contributed 38% of the entire gross output of industry. In 1909, the largest enterprises, representing 1.1% of the total, employed 30.5% of all workers in industry and provided 43.8% of the entire gross industrial output. In 1939, the largest enterprises, making up 5.2% of the total number, concentrated 55% of all the workers employed and 67.5% of the entire gross output of industry. A still narrower group of gigantic industrial corporations, each with assets amounting to more than $100 million, produced in 1954 47% of the total amount of industrial production and received 63% of the total volume of profits. In France in 1952, more than 48% of the total wage bill was paid by very large enterprises numbering only 0.5% of the total number. Russia's industry was marked by a high degree of concentration. In Russia in 1879, large enterprises, with more than 100 workers each, comprised 4.4% of the total, and in them was concentrated 54.8% of the total production. In 1903, 76.6% of all the industrial workers were concentrated in large enterprises, and they were responsible for the overwhelming bulk of industrial production. Concentration of production takes place most quickly in heavy industry and in new branches of industry, chemical, electrical engineering, automobile, etc., and lags behind in light industry, in which in every capitalist country there are many small and medium enterprises. One of the forms of concentration of production is combination, i.e., the uniting in one enterprise of various forms of production which constitute either consecutive stages in the working up of a raw material, e.g., metallurgical combines, which unite the mining of the ore, the smelting of the pig iron, the conversion of the iron into steel and the manufacture of rolled articles, or which are auxiliary to one another, e.g., use of byproducts of an industry. Combination gives the large enterprises still greater preponderance in the competitive struggle. At a certain level of development, the concentration of production brings about monopoly in real earnest. A few dozen giant concerns can more easily come to an agreement amongst themselves than can hundreds and thousands of small ones. On the other hand, in the process of competitive struggle which is played out among themselves by the largest concerns, victory goes to the industrial giants which dispose of enormous amounts of profit, and monopoly ensures high profits. Thus, free competition gives place to monopoly. This changeover constitutes the economic essence of imperialism. The bringing about of monopoly by concentration of production is a regular feature of the present stage of capitalist production. Monopoly means an agreement, alliance, or association between capitalists who concentrate in their hands the production and sale of a substantial part of the production of one or a number of branches, in order to fix high prices for commodities and obtain monopolist high profits. Sometimes monopolies are individual very large concerns which occupy a dominant position in a particular branch of industry. The simplest forms of monopoly are short-term agreements about selling prices. These are known by a variety of names: conventions, corners, rings, etc. More advanced forms of monopoly are cartels, syndicates, trusts, and concerns. A cartel is a monopolistic alliance, the partners in which agree on conditions of sale and terms of payment, divide the markets amongst themselves, decide the quantity of goods to be produced, and fix prices. The quantity of goods which each partner in a cartel is allowed to produce and sell is called his quota. Exceeding the quota is punished by payment of a fine to the common fund of the cartel. A syndicate is a monopoly organization in which the sale of goods, and sometimes also the purchase of raw material, is effected through a common office. A trust is a monopoly in which the ownership of all the enterprises is unified, their owners having become shareholders who draw profit in accordance with the number of shares they hold. A trust is headed by a management which is in charge of all production, sale of goods and finance in respect of the previously independent enterprises. Trusts frequently form part of wider unions called concerns. A concern is an association of a number of enterprises in different branches of industry, commercial firms, banks, transport, and insurance companies, based upon common financial dependence on a particular group of very big capitalists. Monopolies occupy the commanding heights in the economies of the capitalist countries. They embrace heavy industry and also many branches of light industry, railway and river transport, banks, home and foreign trade, and have also brought agriculture under their yoke. Iron and steel production in the USA is dominated by 8 monopolies which in 1953 controlled 83% of all the country's steel production capacity. The two largest of them, the United States Steel Corporation and the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, disposed of 49% of the total productive capacity. The oldest monopoly in the USA is the Petroleum Trust, Standard Oil. In the motor car industry, 3 firms are of decisive importance: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. In the electrical engineering industry, the dominant position is occupied by 2 firms, General Electric and Westinghouse. The chemical industry is controlled by the DuPont de Nemours concern and the aluminium industry by the Mellon concern. In Britain, the role played by monopoly associations grew especially after the First World War, when cartel associations arose in the textile, coal and iron and steel industries and in a number of new industries. Imperial Chemical Industries controls about 9/10 of the total production of basic chemicals, about 2/5 of that of dyes, and almost the entire production of nitrogen in the country. It is closely connected with the principal branches of British industry and in particular with armaments concerns. In Germany, cartels became widespread at the end of last century. In the period between the two world wars, the country was dominated by the Steel Trust, Varianite Stahlwerk, which employed about 200,000 manual and clerical workers, the coal monopolies, the Krupp Arms concern, and the General Electric, e.g. and Siemens electrical equipment concerns. In Western Germany in 1952, the large joint stock companies, those with capital in excess of 10 million marks, held 74% of all the capital of joint stock companies. By 1955, their share of total share capital had grown to 80%. In the mining industry, the largest firms owned 90% of all the share capital, in iron and steel 81%, and in the oil industry 99%. The capitals of the three companies which succeeded the Chemical Trust were 3 times as large as the capitals of all the remaining companies in the chemical industry of Western Germany. In the electrical engineering industry, 8 large firms owned 82% of the share capital. 2 of the largest of them, General Electric, AEG, and Siemens, together with the firms under their control, possessed 75% of all the share capital in the electrical engineering industry. In France, at the present time, the entire production of aluminium is concentrated in the hands of a single company. One firm controls 80% of the entire production of dyestuffs. 75% of shipbuilding is in the hands of 2 companies. 3 companies control 72% of the cement industry, 90% of the manufacture of rubber tires, 65% of the sugar industry. In enterprises belonging to 4 companies are produced 96% of the total output of cars. 5 companies control 70 to 75% of all steel production, 90% of oil refining, and 50% of cotton textiles. In Italy, in Japan, and even in such small countries as Belgium, Sweden, and Switzerland, monopoly organizations hold the commanding heights in industry. In pre-revolutionary Russia, large monopolies embraced first of all the chief branches of heavy industry. The Protomet Syndicate, Association for Sale of the Products of Metallurgical Enterprises, which arose in 1902, controlled the marketing of more than 4/5 of Russia's iron and steel output. In 1904, the Prodvagon Syndicate was organized. This held an almost complete monopoly of the production and marketing of railway trucks. A syndicate of the same kind united the locomotive-making works. The Projegal Syndicate was formed in 1904 by the largest coal enterprises of the Donbass, which belonged to French and Belgian capital. It embraced 3/4 of the entire coal output of the Donbass. Bourgeois economists, trying to whitewash present-day capitalism, affirm that the spread of monopoly tends to cure the bourgeois system of such evils as competition, anarchy of production, and crises. In fact, however, not only can imperialism not eliminate competition, anarchy of production, and crises, but it renders still more acute all the contradictions of capitalism. Lenin showed that imperialism is incapable of reconstructing capitalism from top to bottom. Alongside the predominant role of monopolies, there continue to exist in all capitalist countries numerous medium and small enterprises and masses of petty producers, peasants, and craftsmen. The monopolies formed in certain branches of industry intensify the chaotic character which is inherent in capitalist economy as a whole. The monopolies, which have grown out of free competition, do not eliminate the latter but exist over it and alongside of it, and thereby give rise to a number of very acute, intense antagonisms, frictions, and conflicts. Lenin, Imperialism, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol I, Point 2, page 524. First, competition does not cease inside the monopolies. The members of syndicates and cartels fight among themselves for the most profitable markets and for the largest share quota of production and sales. Within the trusts and concerns, a struggle goes on over the managing positions, over the controlling interests, and over the distribution of profits. Secondly, competition goes on between the monopolies. both between monopolies in one and the same branch and between monopolies in different branches which supply each other with goods, e.g., the steel and motor car trusts, or which produce goods that can be substituted for one another, coal, petroleum, electrical power. Under conditions of a limited capacity of the internal market, the monopolies which produce consumer goods wage a ferocious struggle for outlets for their goods. Thirdly, competition goes on between the monopolies and the enterprises outside the monopolies. The monopolized branches stand in a privileged position relative to others. The monopolies take all possible measures to strangle outsider, pirate enterprises, which do not form part of the monopoly associations. The dominance of monopoly imparts to the competitive struggle a particularly destructive and predatory character. The monopolies unleash for the purpose of strangling a rival all possible methods of direct coercion, bribery, and blackmail, resort to complicated financial intrigues, and make extensive use of the state apparatus. The dominance of monopoly leads to further socialization of production. But the fruits of this socialization fall into the hands of a few monopolists, whose oppression of the remainder of the population becomes particularly heavy. There takes place a further deepening of the basic contradiction of capitalism, the contradiction between the social character of production and the private capitalist form of appropriation, as a result of which crises become still more devastating. Concentration and monopoly in banking. The new role of the banks, our conception of the actual power and importance of present-day monopoly cannot be sufficiently complete unless note be taken of the role of the banks. The concentration of capital and the transition from free competition to monopoly take place in banking as in industry. At first, the banks served mainly as intermediaries for payments. With the development of capitalism, the activity of the banks as traders in capital became more extensive. The accumulation of capital and concentration of production in industry led to the concentration in the banks of enormous amounts of spare money seeking profitable application. The share of the large-scale banks in the total amount of bank turnover steadily grew. In banking as in industry, concentration leads to monopoly. By means of share purchases, granting of credit, etc., the largest banks subject the small ones to themselves. Once having acquired a monopoly position, the big banks conclude agreements among themselves about the division of spheres of influence. Monopoly unions of banks are formed. Each union of this kind rules over dozens and sometimes even of smaller banks, which become in fact branches of the big ones. Through a widespread network of branches, the big banks gather together in their safes the resources of a great number of enterprises. Nearly all the money capital of the capitalist class and the savings of other strata of the population are placed at the disposal of small groups of banking magnates. In the 33 years before the First World War, 1880 to 1913, the mere increase in the total of deposits in the banking systems of the four largest capitalist states, the USA, Germany, Britain, and France, amounted to 127 milliard marks. From then onward, the increase in deposits was still more rapid. In a period less than half as long, from 1913 to 1928, deposits in these countries grew by 183 milliard marks. In the USA, the share taken by the 20 largest banks in the total deposits of all the banks was in 1900 15%, in 1929 19%, in 1939 27%, and in 1952 29%. The total number of commercial banks in the USA declined between 1920 and the end of 1954 from 30,000 to 14,400. In Britain, the total balances of the five biggest banks amounted in 1900 to 28%, in 1916 to 37%, in 1929 to 73%, and in 1952 to 79% of the total balances of all the British banks of deposit. In France, in 1952, 6 banks of deposit held 66% of the total deposits in all the French banks. In Germany, on the eve of the First World War, about one-half of the total deposits in all the banks were concentrated in the big Berlin banks, and in 1929 to 32 2/3. The concentration of industry and the formation of banking monopolies leads to an essential alteration in mutual relations between the banks and industry. As the size of enterprises grows, ever greater becomes the importance of the large-scale, long-term credits granted by the banks to the industrial capitalists. The growth in the amount of deposits placed at the disposal of the banks creates extensive possibilities for such long-term investment of banking resources in industry. The most widespread form in which the money resources of the banks are invested in industry is the purchase of shares in various enterprises. The banks facilitate the formation of joint stock enterprises by undertaking the reorganization of private capitalist enterprises into joint stock companies and the formation of new joint stock companies. Promotion. The sale and purchase of shares is carried out to an ever-increasing extent through the medium of the banks. The interests of the banks and of the industrial enterprises become merged ever closer and closer. When a bank finances a few large enterprises in a particular branch of industry, it becomes interested in monopolistic agreements between these enterprises and facilitates such agreements. In this way, the banks greatly intensify and accelerate the process of concentration of capital and formation of monopolies. The transformation of the banks from modest intermediaries into a handful of all-powerful monopolists is one of the fundamental processes of the transition from the capitalism of the epoch of free competition to monopoly capitalism.